The biting December cold in Chicago made people hurry through the streets of the Bridgeport neighborhood, but nothing compared to the chill that seized Robert Miller's chest when he heard the words that would shatter 30 years of fatherhood in a matter of seconds. He needed to find somewhere to live, his daughter said. He had nothing here anymore. Jessica's voice echoed through the apartment he himself had bought with the sweat of decades, working as a welder in the industrial zone of Hammond, Indiana. The words came from the mouth of the daughter he had raised alone since she was 5 years old, after her mother abandoned her for a younger man with more money. Robert, at 69, stood paralyzed in the living room, holding a small, worn leather suitcase, the same one he used when he traveled for work in the 80s. His hands, calloused from 3 decades of operating welding equipment at the factory, trembled slightly, not from fear, but from an explosive mix of disappointment and disbelief. He asked Jessica, his daughter, what she was telling him. This house was theirs. He bought it for the two of them when she turned 15. Jessica rolled her eyes with the contempt that only ungrateful children can show towards parents who sacrificed everything for them. At 39, a graduate of the University of Illinois at Chicago with her father's money, married to a lawyer from a big firm in the Loop, she now looked at Robert as if he were an obstacle that needed to be removed. "Dad," she said, "you're old now. This house has been in my name for 5 years. You transferred it yourself before the notary, remember? You said it was, so I wouldn't have problems when you died." Robert remembered. It was true. In 2019, when he discovered some nodules in his lung that later turned out to be benign at the county hospital, he was afraid of dying and leaving his daughter bureaucratically stranded. He transferred everything to her name, the house, the old Ford Escort, even the small account at the community bank he had at the time. "But my girl," he said, "it was to protect you. I never thought that you—" "That I what, Dad? Was going to take care of a cranky old man forever. You don't contribute anything. You just spend money on Medicare copays. You make noise watching your soap operas at full volume because you won't accept using a hearing aid, and you still complain about my grilled cheese sandwiches." Tears began to well up in Robert's eyes. It wasn't just Jessica's words, but the coldness with which she said them. It was as if the 30 years he woke up at 4:30 in the morning to make her scrambled eggs and toast before school had never existed, as if the sleepless nights when she had pneumonia at age 8 were just his imagination. He told Jessica he worked his whole life to give her everything. He never remarried so as not to divide his attention. He paid for her degree at UIC, her graduation fees, her wedding at the banquet hall in Lincoln Park. "And I thank you for that, Dad," she replied, "but I've grown up. Chad and I want our privacy. We want to have children, and we can't be taking care of old people at the same time." Robert noticed she didn't say, "taking care of you," or "taking care of my dad." She said, "taking care of old people," as if he were some stranger from the street. From the couple's room came the impatient voice of Chad, the son-in-law. "Honey, have you talked to him yet? The movers are arriving in an hour to bring our new furniture from Macy's." "I'm almost done, Chad," Jessica shouted back. Then she turned to Robert. "Dad, you need to leave today. I've already told people you were leaving. The truck is coming for your old furniture tomorrow morning. His old furniture." Robert looked around at the solid wood bookshelf he had built himself when Jessica was a child, the dining table where they did homework together for years, the armchair where they watched The Simpsons every Sunday. "Dad, that stuff is so outdated. It doesn't match our new minimalist decor. It might be useful to you wherever you end up living." The phrase, "wherever you end up living," pierced Robert like a knife. He had nowhere to go. All his friends from the factory had either passed away or were in nursing homes. His only relatives were some distant cousins in rural Iowa he hadn't seen in decades. He told Jessica he had nowhere to go. "Dad, that's not my problem. You had 68 years to plan. I can't carry your responsibilities forever." How many times can a man feel his heart break before it stops beating completely? Robert discovered the number was much higher than he imagined. Each word from his daughter was another shard. He remembered when she was 7 and told him she wanted to marry him when she grew up because he was the best dad in the world. He remembered the time she would run into his arms when he came home from work, sticky with school glue, shouting, "Daddy," her eyes shining with pure joy. Where had that little girl gone? "All right, my girl," Robert said, feeling something harden in his chest, a door closing forever. "I'm leaving. Perfect. Leave the keys on the entryway table." Robert went up to the room that had been his for 15 years and took only the essentials: some clothes, documents, a photo of little Jessica at her first communion, the only one she hadn't taken off the walls when she redecorated everything in a modern style. At the bottom of the dresser drawer, his fingers found something he hadn't touched in years: an old, faded blue bank card with peeling edges. It was from First National Bank, from the time when they still used those thick magnetic stripe cards. Robert couldn't even remember what account it was for. It must have been from a time he worked at a different company in the 90s. It probably had a few forgotten dollars in it, if it even still worked. He tucked the card into his shirt pocket, more out of nostalgia than hope. He came downstairs with the suitcase in his hand. Jessica was in the kitchen with her back to him, talking on the phone with someone about IKEA furniture and minimalist decor. She didn't even turn around to say goodbye. Robert left the keys on the entryway table as a final act of obedience to a daughter who didn't deserve his submission. He opened the door of the house where he'd been happy for so long and stepped onto the sidewalk. The December cold chilled him to the bone, but Robert felt cold from the inside, from the place where a father's love once existed, which now seemed to have been just his own foolishness. He walked to the bus stop, holding the suitcase that contained all that was left of a lifetime of work and dedication. A few people passed by without a glance. To the world, he was just another old man on the street. To himself, for the first time in 68 years, he wasn't sure who he was. And you, who are listening to me, have you ever been through something like this? Have you ever felt betrayed by the one you loved most? Stay with me until the end of this story, because what happened after that afternoon changed everything. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories of paternal resilience. Before we continue, if you like real stories like this one, tales that show it's never too late for a man to reclaim his dignity, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. I don't tell stories about victims here. I tell stories of fathers who decided to fight back. My name is Robert Miller, and I need to go back in time a bit so you can understand how I got to that point. Being thrown out of my own house by the daughter I raised alone, as if I were a dead weight and not a father who dedicated 3 decades of his life to give her everything I never had. Robert Miller was born in 1955 to a poor family in rural Iowa. His father was a farmhand, and his mother cleaned other people's houses. He was the first in his family to learn to read well, and at 18, he migrated to Chicago with a simple dream: to have a better life. He got a job at a factory in Hammond, operating machines that transformed steel into parts for the auto industry. The work was hard, dangerous, but honest. Robert woke up every day at 4:30, took 2 buses to get to the factory by 6, and worked until 5 p.m. He often worked overtime until 8 to make extra money. At 25, he met Darlene at a dance at the Union Hall. She was pretty, cheerful, and worked as a cashier at a Walmart. They got married in 1982 in a simple party at the parish hall. Robert was radiant. He finally had a family. Jessica was born in 1985, and Robert completely melted. She was a little doll with her mother's cheeks and the green eyes she inherited from him. Robert would spend hours watching her in her crib, planning the future he would give this little girl. She would be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever she wanted to be. She would never face the hardships he did. Darlene, however, did not adapt well to motherhood. She complained that her life was over, that she was trapped at home, that Robert didn't earn enough money to give her what she deserved. When Jessica was 5, Darlene met Anthony, an older merchant who owned a clothing store downtown. "Robert, it's not working anymore," she told him one March afternoon in 1990. "You're a good man, but I want more from life. Anthony is going to give me a bigger house, trips, things you'll never be able to give me." "And Jessica," Robert asked in disbelief, "she's staying with you. You're a better father than I am a mother." Robert was devastated but also determined. If Darlene didn't want to be a mother, he would be both father and mother. He asked for accommodations at work to reorganize his schedule. He found a neighbor to look after Jessica while he was working and completely restructured his life. He would wake up at 4 to make the girls breakfast, get her ready for school, and drop her off at Mrs. Carmen's house before heading to work. In the evening, he would pick Jessica up, make dinner, help her with her homework, give her a bath, and read her stories before bed. Weekends were just for them. Lincoln Park, the zoo, Six Flags when he had extra money. Robert gave up everything for Jessica. He never had another girlfriend. Seriously, he turned down marriage proposals from good women because he was afraid a stepmother might mistreat his little girl. He worked 2 jobs to pay for her private school, English lessons, swimming, ballet, everything she wanted. When Jessica turned 15, Robert used all his accumulated 401k savings as a down payment on a house of their own in Bridgeport. It wasn't a mansion, but it was theirs. 3 bedrooms, a small yard, a garage. He renovated everything himself on weekends, painted, built bookshelves, created a small garden. "Daddy, our house is the prettiest on the block," Jessica said back then, hugging Robert tightly. As a teenager, Jessica was a sweet girl, got good grades, helped around the house, and was affectionate with her dad. Robert felt like the most fulfilled man in the world. All the sacrifices were worth it when she said, "I love you, Daddy," before falling asleep. He paid for her law degree at UIC by working 2 jobs. In addition to the factory, he did carpentry work on weekends. His hands were permanently stained with oil and paint, but Jessica's diploma shone on the living room wall like a trophy of his victory as a father. When she graduated in 2007, Robert cried with pride at the ceremony. Seeing the girl he raised alone in a cap and gown, giving the speech as the class valedictorian, was the happiest moment of his life. "Daddy, everything I am today, I owe to you," Jessica said that day, hugging Robert in front of all her classmates. Jessica got an internship at a large law firm and was soon hired. She met Chad, also a lawyer, from an upper-middle-class family from the North Shore. The courtship was quick, and the wedding in 2010 was a big party that Robert paid for using his savings and a loan that took him 3 years to pay off. After the wedding, things began to change. Jessica became more distant, more critical. She complained about Robert's humble house, the food he made, his old-fashioned way of dressing. Chad was never rude, but Robert felt that his son-in-law looked at him with a certain superiority, as one tolerates a poor relative. "Dad needs to modernize," Jessica would tell him. "Buy better clothes, get some dental work, change that haircut." Robert tried, but it was never enough. No matter how hard he tried, he felt he was constantly being judged. Still, he continued to help financially. He paid for part of Jessica's new car, helped with the remodeling of the young couple's apartment, and was always available when they needed something. In 2019, when he had that health scare, Robert decided to get everything in order. He transferred the house to Jessica's name, made a will leaving her his small savings, and organized all his documents. He wanted to be sure his daughter would be protected if anything happened to him. "Dad, you're not going to die anytime soon," Jessica laughed at the time. But it's good to have everything organized. Robert recovered completely, but never reversed the transfers. He trusted his daughter completely. She was his blood, his little girl, the person he had lived for 30 years. How could Robert imagine that this little girl he used to rock to sleep when she had nightmares would one day throw him out of the house as if he were a stranger? How can a father prepare for the moment he discovers that the love he dedicated his life to cultivating simply no longer exists? There is a specific loneliness of a man who raised a daughter alone, and then she became a stranger. It is the loneliness of one who gave everything and was left with nothing. The signs had started subtly after Jessica's wedding, but Robert, like most fathers, preferred to interpret them as an adjustment phase. After all, it was natural for a newly married daughter to want her independence, right? The first sign was the change in her tone of voice. Jessica, who had always spoken to him with affection, began to speak with a slightly impatient tone, as if conversations with her dad were a boring obligation to be fulfilled quickly. "Dad, I can't talk right now, I'm busy," became the typical response when he called to see how she was. The calls, which were once daily and lasted half an hour, dwindled to weekly 5-minute contacts. Robert attributed this to the fact that she was building her new life. "It's normal," he told himself. "She's happy, busy, that's what matters." The second sign was the disdain for the family traditions they had built together. Every Sunday, since Jessica was little, they ate together. Robert would cook her favorite meal, pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, and iced tea. It was the moment of the week he looked forward to the most. "Dad, we can't today. We have a commitment at Chad's family's house." It started to become the recurring excuse. One Sunday became two became a month became occasional. The traditions that took decades to build unraveled in a matter of months. When Robert tried to express how much he missed them, Jessica would roll her eyes. "Dad, don't be so dramatic. I have my own life now. You should find something to do too." The third sign was shame. Robert began to realize that Jessica was embarrassed by him when they were in public. At a birthday party for one of her work colleagues, he noticed how she sidestepped when someone asked about her family. "My dad is retired," she would say, omitting that he had worked for 35 years as a welder to pay for her education. Retired sounded better than welder, less blue-collar. Robert pretended not to notice, but it hurt. It hurt because he was proud of the work he had done. He was proud of the machines he operated, the parts he helped manufacture, the honest sweat that paid for every one of Jessica's expenses. But for her, apparently, it was a source of shame. The fourth sign was financial exploitation disguised as family help. Even though she was married and professionally established, Jessica continued to ask Robert for money. At first, it was for specific things. "Dad, can you lend me 5,000? Chad is waiting for a payment that's delayed." Robert always gave it. He never asked when she would pay it back because he understood that children don't repay loans to their fathers. Children receive help. But the requests increased in frequency and amount. "Dad, I need 10,000 to furnish the new office." "Dad, can you help me with 1,500? The car needed expensive maintenance." "Dad, 3,000 for a work trip that will pay off big in the future." Robert would take from his small savings, dip into his retirement, sometimes even borrow money to help his daughter. He never questioned it. A loving father doesn't charge his child, he thought. What he didn't know was that there was no delayed payment, no urgent furniture, no work trip. Chad and Jessica had simply gotten used to using her dad as a financial reserve whenever they wanted something extra. A nicer restaurant, a weekend in Lake Geneva, designer clothes. "It's my dad's money. He's obligated to help," Jessica would tell Chad. "He has nothing else in his life besides me." The fifth sign was the explicit disrespect for his opinions and feelings. Robert had become a sort of decorative figure in his daughter's life. He was there, he was tolerated, but his words had no weight. When he tried to give advice based on his life experience, Jessica would sigh heavily. "Dad, the world has changed. You don't understand how things work now." When he expressed that he missed spending more time together, she would respond with irritation. "Dad, I can't be your only source of entertainment. Get a hobby, do some activity." When he commented that he missed the conversations they used to have, she was blunt. "We don't have that much in common anymore, Dad. It's natural." Robert swallowed every slight, every indifference, every moment he felt like a nuisance. He justified it all because his fatherly love spoke louder than his self-love. "She's stressed with work, she's adjusting to marriage, it will get better." There are pains a man swallows for years until one day his throat can't take it anymore. The sixth sign was emotional manipulation. Whenever Robert showed any questioning of Jessica's behavior, she used the same strategy: play the victim and turn the tables. The game. "Dad, I work so much. I'm always tired, and I still have to put up with you demanding my attention. It's not fair. Dad, you're being selfish. I have a right to my own life. Dad, if you keep this up, I'm going to have to pull away completely." Is that what you want? Robert always backed down. He would apologize for feelings that were legitimate, for emotional needs that were normal. He accepted the blame for things that were not his fault. The seventh sign was systematic exclusion. Jessica stopped inviting him to important events in her life. Her promotion at the law firm was celebrated at a party he wasn't invited to. Their wedding anniversary was celebrated on a trip he wasn't informed about. Chad's professional achievements were cause for a family dinner. Chad's family. "It was just a small thing, Dad. I didn't want to bother you," was always the justification. Robert began to realize he was becoming more and more peripheral in the life of the person who was the center of his life. But he still couldn't name what was happening. He still believed it was a phase, a misunderstanding, something that would be resolved with patience and understanding. The eighth and final sign was complete dehumanization. Jessica stopped treating him like a dad and started treating him like a problem to be managed. His emotional needs became excessive neediness. His desire to participate in her life became an invasion of privacy. His fatherly love became an unhealthy attachment. "Dad, you need to understand that our relationship can't be like it was when I was a child. I'm an adult now." Robert tried to adapt to this new dynamic, but it was impossible. How does a father stop being a father? How does someone who loved unconditionally for 30 years learn to love with conditions? The house that was once their home became Jessica's territory, where Robert was merely tolerated. Meals together disappeared, conversations were reduced to practical matters, and physical affection, the hugs, the kisses on the forehead, vanished. Robert was becoming a stranger in his own home, an unwanted guest in his own daughter's life, and still he couldn't accept that all was lost. He kept waiting for the affectionate Jessica of before to return. He kept believing that the fatherly love he had cultivated for decades couldn't have simply died. How could he imagine that the signs were not just a difficult phase, but the conscious preparation for the moment she would finally get rid of him completely? The same man who carried his daughter on his shoulders one day found himself with no ground to stand on. The true nature of the exploitation Robert was suffering only became clear years later, when he accidentally found the WhatsApp conversations Jessica and Chad exchanged about him. But in that period, between 2020 and 2024, Robert lived in complete denial of what was happening. The system was simple and cruel. Jessica had discovered she could use her father's love as a tool for financial and emotional extraction without giving anything in return. Robert, like most men of his generation, couldn't see the manipulation because he was raised to believe that fathers exist to give, not to receive. "Dad, I'm in a tough spot at the firm. I need to buy a new suit to impress an important client. Can you help me with $1,500? Robert wouldn't hesitate. He'd dip into his savings, tighten his monthly budget, but he'd give it. Jessica would take the money and spend it on a weekend in Miami with Chad. When Robert asked about the client, she'd change the subject. Dad, Chad's car broke down and he needs it for work. Can you lend us $3,000 for the repair? Robert would take out a high-interest bank loan to help. Chad's car wasn't broken down. They wanted money to furnish the new apartment they had rented without telling Robert. Dad, we're thinking of having a child and we want to buy a bigger apartment. Can you help us with the down payment? It's an investment for your future grandchild. Robert was so excited by the prospect of becoming a grandfather that he liquidated his retirement account and gave them $25,000 for the future grandchild. Jessica and Chad used the money for a month-long trip to Europe. There were never any real plans to have children. The pattern repeated monthly. There was always an emergency, an investment, an opportunity that justified Robert opening his wallet, and he always opened it because he believed he was investing in his daughter's future, that he was being the father he promised to be when Darlene abandoned them. What Robert didn't understand was that every yes he gave reinforced Jessica's perception that he existed to serve her. Every sacrifice he made was interpreted by her not as love, but as an obligation. In her mind, Robert owed her all of this for having complicated her life with his presence. My dad has to help, Jessica would tell her friends. He never remarried. He has no other expenses. His money is for me. Chad, initially uncomfortable with the exploitation, soon got used to it. Your dad has a good pension. He doesn't have big expenses anymore, and you two have a special relationship. It's natural that he wants to help. The exploitation wasn't just financial. Jessica also used Robert as an emotional babysitter, dumping on him all the frustrations and problems she didn't want to share with important people in her life. When she fought with Chad, she would call Robert crying, "Dad, I think my marriage is falling apart. I don't know what to do." Robert would drop everything to comfort her, give advice, offer support. The next day, Jessica would be posting happy pictures with Chad on Facebook, and Robert would realize he had been used merely as a temporary sounding board. When she had problems at work, Robert became her unpaid consultant. "Dad, I need your opinion on a strategy." He would spend hours on the phone helping her think of solutions. When Jessica solved the problem using his ideas, she never mentioned her father's contribution to anyone. When she wanted validation for questionable decisions, Robert was summoned. "Dad, what do you think about me leaving this job to open my own practice?" He would offer support, encourage her, even offer to help financially. When Jessica decided not to leave her job, Robert discovered the consultation had just been for her to feel supported in a decision she had already made. The specific difficulty for men of Robert's generation is that they were raised in an era when fathers couldn't show vulnerability. Robert swallowed all the humiliations, all the exploitations, all the indifference, because real men endure in silence. He never told anyone what he was feeling. He never sought psychological help. He never opened up to a friend. He never admitted to himself that he was being emotionally abused by his own daughter. For his generation, that would be admitting weakness, admitting failure as a father. The few friends Robert still had from his factory days were dying or moving away. He became more and more isolated, depending more and more on his daughter for any kind of emotional contact. And Jessica knew this and used it against him. "Dad, if you keep pressuring me, I'm going to have to pull away. Is that what you want, to be left all alone?" The threat of abandonment was the ultimate weapon. Robert was so afraid of losing his daughter that he accepted anything to maintain the connection. He accepted crumbs of affection. He accepted being treated like a human ATM. He accepted being systematically disrespected. Robert's body began to reflect the psychological abuse. He developed nervous gastritis from swallowing so much anger. He started having insomnia, waking up at 3 a.m., wondering if he had done something to deserve the treatment he was receiving. He developed a silent depression, the kind of sadness older men carry without naming. His hair turned completely white in 2 years. His hands developed a slight tremor from anxiety. He started losing weight because he had no desire to cook just for himself, especially after Jessica criticized his food as too greasy and unsophisticated. The worst part was that Robert had internalized Jessica's narrative. He began to believe that he really was a burden, that he really was being too dramatic, that he really needed to give his daughter space. Maybe she's right, he would think during sleepless nights. Maybe I'm too possessive. Maybe I'm being selfish, wanting her attention. This self-deception is common in victims of emotional abuse, especially older men who are conditioned not to question the authority of their adult children. Robert was being systematically convinced that his feelings were inadequate, his expectations unrealistic, his needs excessive. Jessica's strategy was perfect. The more she criticized and isolated him, the more desperate he became to win back her love. The more needy he became, the more she used that neediness as a justification to treat him poorly. It was a cruel and efficient cycle. Dad is so clingy. It annoys me. Robert, instead of questioning why a daughter would be annoyed by her father's affection, blamed himself for being clingy and pulled away even further. During the years 2020 to 2024, Robert lived in systematic loneliness. He woke up alone, ate breakfast alone, watched television alone, went to sleep alone. His only significant social interactions were the bi-weekly calls from Jessica asking for money or venting about her problems. He tried other activities. He attended a senior group at his church, but felt out of place because all the other men talked about their grandchildren, the trips they took with their families, the Sunday dinners. Robert didn't have that. He just had a daughter who treated him like a bank account. He tried to make new friends, but at 65 plus, making true friendships is difficult. People his age are busy with their own families or their own health problems. Younger people aren't interested in a friendship with a retired gentleman. The specific loneliness of older men abandoned by their children is unlike any other loneliness. It is the loneliness of someone who invested everything in one person and discovered it was a bad investment. In 2023, Robert had an anxiety attack that sent him to the hospital. He called Jessica from the emergency room. "My girl, I'm at the county hospital. I had a heart problem, I think." "Dad, I'm in an important meeting. Is it serious?" It wasn't. "Then I'll finish up here and we'll talk later." Robert spent 6 hours alone in the hospital, finding out he didn't have a heart problem, just a panic attack. When he finally spoke with Jessica 12 hours later, she said, "Good thing it wasn't anything serious, Dad. Next time, try to call me only if it's really urgent. Really urgent." Robert had called his daughter because he thought he was dying, and she thought it wasn't really urgent. It was at that moment that something inside Robert began to crack. Not break completely, but crack. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to question if he was being treated well, but he still couldn't name what was happening. He still believed that if he were a better, more present, more useful father, Jessica would love him again, as she once did. In early 2024, Robert made a decision he thought would solve everything. He signed additional documents confirming that all the assets transferred in 2019 would remain permanently in Jessica's name, waiving any future right of reversion. He thought this definitive gesture of love and trust would show her how much he loved her, how much he trusted her. "Dad, thank you so much," Jessica said when she received the documents. "Now I can finally rest easy about the future." Robert expected that after this she would become more affectionate, more present. After all, he had given her everything he had. It was the ultimate proof of a father's love. What he didn't realize was that he had just signed his own eviction notice. Sometimes, after bridges are burned, they don't need to be rebuilt, even if you helped build them. The December morning Robert was kicked out of his house passed slowly, as if time itself conspired for him to feel every second of humiliation. He walked the streets of Bridgeport, carrying his old suitcase, with no destination, no plan, no hope. Around 2 in the afternoon, the cold became unbearable, and he took refuge in a small park near the subway station. He sat on a bench under the shade of a large oak tree and tried to process what had happened. For the first time in his 68 years of life, Robert Miller didn't know what to do. He took out the few documents he had managed to grab from his pocket: his driver's license, social security card, Medicare card, and that faded blue card he had found in the drawer. He looked at the old card from First National Bank. The edges were peeling, the name almost worn off, but you could still read it. Robert Miller. What era was this from? Robert tried to remember. It must have been from the 90s, when he worked for a few months at a subcontracting company before returning to his main factory job. Back then, the company required employees to open an account at First National to receive their paychecks. There was probably nothing in the account, maybe a few forgotten dollars, if it even still existed. But Robert had no other options. His current cards were all in his name, with Jessica as a beneficiary, and she had probably already cancelled everything. Around 3:30, Robert walked to the nearest First National Bank branch. The building was modern, with cold air conditioning and organized lines. He felt out of place inside, with his simple clothes and old suitcase. He took a number and waited. When he was called, he went to a window where a young woman attended to him with professional but distant politeness. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you?" "Good afternoon, miss. I'd like to check the balance of a very old account. I have this card here, but I don't remember the PIN." Robert held out the faded blue card. The employee took it, looked at it with curiosity, and typed something into her computer. "Mr. Robert Miller," she confirmed, looking at his ID. "That's right, I'll check the system." That's strange." Robert felt his stomach tighten. "Is there a problem?" "Nothing is showing up in the current system, sir. This account might be very old. I'll try the legacy system." She typed a few more commands. "I'm going to call my supervisor. Please hold." A middle-aged man approached, looked at the screen, frowned, and typed something. Then he looked Robert up and down, as if re-evaluating who this simple man in front of him was. "Mr. Miller, I'm going to need to transfer you to the manager. Please come with me." Robert was led to a small room with stronger air conditioning, a glass table, and leather chairs. The manager was a well-dressed man of about 45 who stood up to greet him with more respect than Robert expected. "Mr. Robert Miller, my name is Morris. I'm the manager of this branch. Please, have a seat." Robert settled into the chair, trying to understand why he was being treated with such solemnity for an account that probably had $50 in it. Maurice typed something into his computer, looked at the screen, typed again, and looked again. His face gradually changed, shifting from professional curiosity to something close to astonishment. "Mr. Miller," Maurice said in a lower voice, "are you aware of the history of this account?" "No, honestly, it's very old. I don't think I've ever used it. I just wanted to see if there was anything left." Maurice clicked through more screens. His expression changed completely. He looked at Robert, then the screen, then back at Robert. "Sir," he said with a shaky voice, "do you know how much money is in here?" Robert felt something strange in the air. The question was asked in a tone that was not normal for discussing small amounts. "I have no idea. It must be a little bit, right? $100, maybe." Maurice turned the monitor towards Robert. When Robert saw the numbers on the screen, his hands trembled. They didn't tremble with anxiety or fear, as they had been trembling for the past few years. They trembled from pure shock. 1, 847, 356, 70. Robert blinked several times, thinking his eyes were deceiving him. He looked again. The number was still there. That's almost $2 million, he whispered. Yes, sir. 1, 847, 356, 70, Maurice confirmed. And from the activity I'm seeing here, that value has been growing automatically for decades. Robert remained silent for a long time, staring at the screen. Maurice respected the silence. How? How is that possible, he finally asked. From what I'm seeing in the history, Maurice explained, consulting several screens, this account was opened in 1994 with an initial deposit of $10. From there, automatic monthly deposits of $500 were made from 1994 to 1998. After that, it's all been compound interest for 26 years. Robert tried to process the information. 1994 to 1998. He remembered. It was the period when he worked for that subcontracting company that did work for a major auto manufacturer. They paid better than the factory, and he worked a lot of overtime. At that time, Jessica was about 10 years old, and he wanted to save money for her future. I had completely forgotten, he murmured. They were automatic deductions from my paycheck. I remember now. It was a kind of forced savings plan the company offered. And apparently, Maurice continued, you never touched the account again. With compound interest and some conservative automatic investments the bank made over the years, the money just multiplied. Robert looked at the screen again. Almost $2 million. The man who, just 4 hours ago, had been kicked out of his house by his daughter for being a burden, was now looking at almost $2 million he didn't even know he had. Mr. Miller, Maurice said gently, would you like to make a transaction? Transfer this to an active checking account? Robert didn't answer immediately. A strange sensation was taking hold of him. It wasn't joy, it wasn't relief. It was something colder, more controlled. It was clarity. For the first time in years, Robert felt free to think without the fog of emotional dependency. He no longer needed to swallow humiliations in exchange for crumbs of affection. He no longer needed to accept being treated like a bank account by a daughter who had just thrown him out of the house. He had power now, real, concrete, financial power. Maurice, Robert said with a voice that surprised even himself with its firmness, I need to open a new checking account, a completely new one, and I'm going to need some special services. Of course, Mr. Miller. What kind of services? Robert thought for a moment. For 30 years, he had been just a dad, a provider, a man whose identity was completely defined by his relationship with Jessica. Now, for the first time since 1990, he was Robert Miller, just Robert Miller. And Robert Miller had almost $2 million. First, I want to transfer all of this money to a new account that only I have access to. Second, I want it to be absolutely confidential. Third, I'm going to need a recommendation for a good lawyer specializing in family law. Maurice nodded positively at each request. And finally, Robert said with a coldness he didn't know he possessed, I'm going to need to hire a private investigator. 2 weeks passed since Robert disappeared from Jessica's life. For her, the first few days were pure relief. She finally had the house to herself and Chad. She could finally redecorate without hearing complaints about wasting money. She could finally live without her dad's heavy energy hanging around the house. Honey, I can't believe it took me so long to do this, she told Chad the first night, cuddled up with him on the new sofa they had bought. I should have made this decision years ago. Chad, although he agreed they needed their privacy, felt slightly uneasy about the coldness with which Jessica had thrown her father out, but he said nothing. Their relationship had improved significantly without Robert's presence. In the first few days, Jessica busied herself selling Robert's old furniture and buying new pieces. Every piece of furniture that left was like erasing another trace of her dad from her new life. Look how modern the living room is. Without that horrible bookshelf he made, she would show the friends who came to visit. Now it looks like a civilized person's house. But by the end of the second week, Jessica began to feel something strange. It wasn't exactly nostalgia, it was more like a financial void. She was used to being able to count on her dad's loans whenever she needed extra cash. Suddenly that source had dried up. "Chad, we need to remodel the bathroom. It's so outdated," she commented one afternoon. "How much will that cost?" he asked. "About 8,000. It's not a big deal." "Jessica, our budget is tight this month. Maybe next year." "Next year?" Jessica frowned. She wasn't used to hearing no for expenses. Robert had always been there to cover the extras. It was then that she realized it. Kicking out her dad also meant losing the paternal bank. At first, she thought it would be temporary. Robert always came back after their fights. He always apologized, always submitted. But this time was different. Robert didn't call, didn't text, didn't show up at the door asking for forgiveness. It was as if he had simply vanished from the face of the earth. In the third week, Jessica started to worry. Not out of affection, she had developed an impressive ability to disconnect her filial feelings. But for practical reasons. What if Robert had died? What if he was struggling? What if someone found out she had kicked her own father out of the house? "Chad, maybe we should look for my dad," she suggested one night. "I thought you didn't want any more contact with him. I don't want him living here, but I don't want him to die on the street either. It would be terrible for our reputation if anyone found out." Chad agreed it would be better to know where Robert was, even if it was just to be sure he wouldn't come back to bother them. Jessica called her dad's cell phone. The number was disconnected. She tried the landline he used to have at the house, also disconnected. She tried to reach out through some old acquaintances from the factory. No one had heard from Robert in weeks. "Strange," Jessica muttered. "Where does a 68-year-old man just disappear to?" In the fourth week, she started to get genuinely annoyed, not out of love, but because the situation was slipping from her control. Jessica had always had total control over Robert. She knew exactly where he was, what he was doing, how much money he had. Now, suddenly, he had completely disappeared. Worse, rumors were starting to circulate among the neighbors. Mrs. Martinez, who had lived next door for 20 years, had asked, "Jessica, where's your dad? I haven't seen him in the yard in a while." "Oh, he went to visit some relatives in Iowa," Jessica lied. But the question bothered her. If the neighbors started asking too many questions, it could become a social problem for her. In the fifth week, Jessica decided to actively look for Robert. First, she went to the clinic where he had regular appointments. The receptionist informed her that he had cancelled all future appointments. Strange. Robert was a hypochondriac. He would never miss a doctor's appointment. Next, she went to the bank where he received his pension. The manager, respecting banking confidentiality, only said that Mr. Miller was doing fine and handling his affairs normally. Even stranger. If Robert was handling his affairs normally, it meant he wasn't destitute. Where on earth was he living? It was then that Jessica made a decision that would change everything. She hired a private investigator to find Robert. What she couldn't imagine was that Robert had made the exact same decision, to hire a private investigator to investigate her. In the sixth week after the eviction, Jessica received a call she didn't expect. "Hello, Jessica Miller." "Yes, who's speaking?" "This is attorney Edward Carter. I represent Robert Miller. I would like to schedule a meeting with you." Jessica's heart raced. Dad with a lawyer? That made no sense. Robert never had money for a lawyer. A meeting for what? To discuss family and financial matters of mutual interest. "Could you come to my office this afternoon?" "What financial matters?" "My dad has no assets. Mrs. Miller, it would be best if we discuss this in person. My office is in the Loop. May I send you the address?" Jessica hung up, disturbed. The Loop was an expensive area with expensive offices. How had Robert hired a lawyer from the Loop? She arrived at Attorney Carter's office at 4 p.m., accompanied by Chad. The building was glass and steel, modern, with a marble lobby, definitely expensive. Attorney Carter received them in an elegant conference room. He was a man in his 50s, with an impeccable suit and an expensive leather briefcase on the table. "Please have a seat," he said with professional but cold courtesy. "Sir," Jessica began, "I don't understand what's happening. How did my dad hire a lawyer? He doesn't have money for this." Attorney Carter smiled slightly. "Mrs. Miller, that is precisely the issue we need to discuss." He opened his briefcase and took out some documents. "My client, Mr. Robert Miller, hired me to inform you of some important discoveries he recently made." "What discoveries?" "First, Mr. Miller discovered that he possesses significant financial resources that he had completely forgotten about." Jessica and Chad looked at each other. "What resources?" "An old bank account with approximately $18 million. Jessica's jaw literally dropped. Chad turned pale. That's impossible," she stammered. "My dad is a retired welder. He doesn't have $8 million. "Yes, he does, Ma'am." "And second," Attorney Carter continued relentlessly, "my client also discovered some interesting information about you." He took a series of photographs and bank statements from his briefcase. "These are photos of you and Mr. Chad at expensive establishments over the last 5 years, restaurants, trips, hotels. And these are your bank statements from the same period." Attorney Carter spread the documents on the table. "What our investigator found is that your declared income as a junior associate would not be sufficient to afford this lifestyle." Jessica looked at the photos, horrified. There were pictures of her and Chad in Paris, in Cancun, at ridiculously expensive restaurants in Chicago. Photos she herself had posted on Instagram, but now arranged chronologically as evidence. "Sir, I don't understand where you're going with this. I'm getting to the fact that my client financed this lifestyle of yours for years without any knowledge of his own true financial situation. In other words, you extracted approximately $80,000 from my client over the past 5 years using false information about emergencies and needs." Chad tried to intervene. "Sir, that's normal between family. Not when it's based on lies, Mr. Chad. We have here." Attorney Carter pulled out more papers, "The WhatsApp conversations between the two of you planning how to extract money from Mr. Miller." Jessica turned white. "How did you get our conversations?" "Mr. Miller had access to your WhatsApp backup, as you shared the same Google account for years to save money. He just didn't know he could access it. Now he does." Attorney Carter read some of the conversations. "I'm going to make up a story about the car breaking down and ask the old man for $2,000. Jessica Miller, March 15th, 2023. Your dad is so naive. If he knew he had money saved up, why wouldn't he say so? Chad Morgan, July 20th, 2023. Better this way. As long as he thinks he's poor, he'll keep giving me whatever I ask for. Jessica Miller, July 20th, 2023. The silence in the room was deafening. Jessica was going through all the stages of being exposed: denial, anger, negotiation. "Fine, sir. My dad found out he has money, and he found out I lied a few times. So what? What does he want?" Attorney Carter smiled coldly. "My client wants 2 very simple things, Mrs. Miller. First, that you return the $80,000 you extracted from him through fraud over the past 5 years. I don't have $80,000. Second, that you return the house he transferred to your name in 2019 and 2024. The house is mine. The house was transferred under emotional coercion and based on false information about my client's financial condition. It constitutes a fraudulent property transfer." Chad tried to stand up, but Attorney Carter stopped him with a gesture. "Sit down. I'm not finished yet." He took one last document from his briefcase. "This is the report from the private investigator my client hired. In addition to the financial fraud, we discovered something interesting about Mr. Chad." Chad turned even paler. "He has a girlfriend named Amanda, 28 years old, whom he meets on Tuesdays and Thursdays at an apartment in Lincoln Park. They are even planning to move into a condo together in River North." Jessica turned to Chad, her eyes wide. "What?" "Honey, I can explain." "So," Attorney Carter continued relentlessly, "to summarize, Mrs. Miller, you defrauded your own father for years. You kicked him out of his house based on a false narrative about your own financial importance. And now you discover you're married to a man who, for the past 2 years, has had a parallel family, partially financed with the money you stole from your father." Jessica was in complete shock. Everything her life had been based on for the last few years had crumbled in 30 minutes. What does my dad want from me?" she whispered. Attorney Carter closed his briefcase. "My client no longer wants anything from you, Mrs. Miller. He's had a daughter. Now he wants justice." 6 months after the meeting in Attorney Carter's office, Robert was unrecognizable. Not just physically, although he had lost 30 pounds, grown a well-groomed grey beard, and adopted a completely new wardrobe. The most impressive transformation was internal. He woke up every day at 6:30 in his new apartment in River North, a place he strategically chose for being far from anywhere Jessica might accidentally run into him. It wasn't an ostentatious apartment. Robert had learned at 68 that true wealth doesn't need to be flaunted. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, a discreet view of the city, and simple but quality furniture. For the first time in decades, Robert had furnished a space thinking only of his own comfort and taste, without considering anyone else's opinion. His morning routine had become sacred. Black coffee. Reading the news on the tablet he learned to use. Half an hour of light exercise recommended by the personal trainer he had hired. At 68, Robert was discovering the pleasure of taking care of his own body without having to justify unnecessary vanity expenses to anyone. Attorney Carter had become more than a lawyer. He was a friend. He was the one who introduced Robert to a world he never knew existed. The world of successful, mature men who had rebuilt their lives after family betrayals. "Robert, you need to meet the guys from the club," Attorney Carter said one afternoon. "They're men who've been through similar situations. It'll do you good to have a new social network." The club was an informal group that met on Thursdays at a discreet restaurant downtown. 10 men between 50 and 75, all with stories of starting over after traumatic divorces, ungrateful children, or family betrayals. Robert arrived at the first meeting nervous, thinking he would have nothing in common with these men. He was wrong. "My son," said Fernando, a 65-year-old former executive, "sued me to try to get his inheritance early when he found out I owned a company. He claimed I was incompetent to manage my own assets. My daughter, shared Joseph, a retired doctor, convinced me to transfer my practice to her name to avoid taxes. Then she kicked me out of the very clinic I built, over 30 years of work." Robert realized he wasn't alone. There were other men who had gone through similar betrayals and not only survived, but thrived. More importantly, there were men who understood the specific pain of being betrayed by your own blood. "The difference, Robert," Attorney Carter explained in a private conversation, "is that you discovered the betrayal while you still have your health and the resources to do something about it. Many discover it too late." The months passed, and Robert developed a confidence he had never had. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't Jessica's dad or Darlene's ex-husband. He was Robert Miller, period. And Robert Miller was an interesting man. He enrolled in an art history course at the Art Institute of Chicago. He had always liked museums, but never had the time or money to delve deeper. Now, he had both. He discovered he had his own opinions about art, specific tastes, and an intellectual curiosity that had been suppressed for decades of financial survival. "You have a very keen eye for colonial art," the professor commented after a class on early American architecture. "Have you ever thought of taking a trip to Philadelphia to see the works in person?" Robert had never thought of traveling alone. For 30 years, any extra money was for Jessica. Now the idea of a cultural trip to Philadelphia was not only possible, but appealing. He spent a week in Philadelphia by himself, visiting historic churches, photographing architectural details, and talking with tour guides who were impressed with his knowledge. For the first time in decades, Robert had the time and mental space to simply contemplate beauty without thinking about obligations or responsibilities to other people. On the trip, he met Helen, a 62-year-old retired teacher, also passionate about history. They walked together through the cobblestone streets of Philadelphia, comparing notes on sculptures, debating historical periods. "You have a very interesting perspective on colonial art," Helen said over coffee at a local cafe. "It's refreshing to talk with someone who really gets it." Robert was surprised by the comment. It had been so long since someone had valued his opinion on anything. For years, Jessica had treated any of his knowledge as outdated or irrelevant. "Thank you, Helen. It's nice to be able to talk about these things with someone who appreciates them." They exchanged phone numbers and kept in touch. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was a genuine friendship based on common interests and mutual respect. For Robert, this was an extraordinary novelty. Back in Chicago, Robert immersed himself in other personal projects he had postponed for decades. He started learning Italian, a language he had always wanted to master. He hired a private tutor and discovered he had a knack for languages. "Mr. Robert, your pronunciation is very good," his teacher praised. "Have you thought about visiting Italy?" Robert had thought about it, yes, and for the first time in his life he could take an international trip without having to justify himself or ask anyone for permission. But before traveling, Robert wanted to completely resolve the matter with Jessica. 6 months after the meeting, Attorney Carter called him for a conversation. "Robert, we have an update on your case. What's new?" "Jessica couldn't pay the $80,000 and is offering to return the house in exchange for forgiving the debt." Robert was silent for a long time. "Did she lose her job?" he finally asked. "She did. The firm found out she was using company resources for personal expenses, and her marriage to Chad ended after our investigation revealed the infidelity. She's living in a small rented apartment and surviving on freelance work." Robert felt something strange. It wasn't joy for revenge or sadness for his daughter's situation. It was a sense of closure, of a completed cycle. "And what do you think I should do, Edward? Legally, you can demand both the house and the money. It's your right. And humanly," Attorney Carter smiled, "humanly, you need to decide what kind of man you want to be from now on." Robert thought for a few days, talked with his friends from the club, each giving a different opinion. Fernando thought he should tighten the screws until she learned her lesson. Joseph thought he should forgive so he could move on in peace. In the end, Robert made a decision that surprised everyone. "Edward, I'll accept only the house back. She can keep the money. I don't want anything else from Jessica, and I don't owe her anything. We're even. Are you sure?" "I'm sure. I want you to draw up an official document stating that we no longer have any financial or mutual obligations. As of today, I don't have a daughter, and she doesn't have a father. Legally and practically." Attorney Carter drafted the document. Jessica signed without question, relieved not to have to pay the $80,000. Sometimes after bridges are burned, they don't need to be rebuilt, even if you helped build them. Robert sold the house in Bridgeport. He could no longer see it as a home. It was just a property filled with painful memories. With the money from the sale and his nearly $2 million, he had complete financial freedom to rebuild his life as he wished. He bought a smaller house in Lincoln Park, in a community for mature adults. His neighbors were other men and women between 60 and 80 who had chosen to live independently, but with a small support community. When a father is betrayed by his own blood, the scar cuts across generations, but sometimes the scar becomes a source of strength. Robert didn't become bitter. That was his greatest victory. He could have turned into a resentful man, obsessively talking about Jessica's ingratitude to anyone who would listen. Instead, he chose to use the experience as fuel for a better life. He created a small fund to help older men betrayed by their families. It wasn't ostentatious charity, but discreet help provided through Attorney Carter to men going through similar situations who lacked resources. There are a lot of fathers being exploited by their own children, he would tell Helen, with whom he now had a serious and healthy relationship. If I can help a few of them discover their worth, my experience wasn't in vain. Helen admired Robert's ability to transform pain into purpose. They had become true partners, two mature people who chose each other without neediness or dependency, simply for the mutual pleasure of being together. "You've become an impressive man, Robert," Helen said one afternoon while they were visiting a modern art exhibit. "It must have been hard to rebuild everything at 68. "You know what I discovered, Helen," Robert replied. "I didn't rebuild anything. I built myself for the first time, because before I was just a dad, just a provider, just a function. Now I'm Robert, and Robert is an interesting man." It was true. At 69, Robert Miller had become a version of himself that had never had a chance to exist. He was cultured. He had been to Italy and spoke decent Italian. He had his own opinions on art, politics, and literature. He had true friends who respected him for who he was, not for what he could give. He had a partner who chose to be with him because she enjoyed his company, not because she needed his resources. He had a routine that served his own interests, hobbies that fulfilled him, and personal projects that gave him meaning. And for the first time in decades, Robert Miller slept peacefully every night, knowing that the next day he would wake up to live his own life, not the life others expected him to live. 2 years after being kicked out of his house by his own daughter, Robert Miller was sitting on the patio of his Lincoln Park home, drinking his morning coffee while reading a book about the Italian Renaissance. It was a Saturday morning in September, with that pleasant autumn sun that Chicago sometimes offers. Helen was beside him, reading a biography of Georgia O'Keeffe. They had planned to visit one of her exhibitions in the afternoon after lunch at an Italian restaurant they had discovered in River North. It was a simple but full life. The phone rang. Robert looked at the screen. Unknown number. "Hello, Dad?" The voice on the other end was hesitant, broken. "Jessica." Robert was silent for a few seconds. Helen looked at him with a question in her eyes. "How did you get my number?" Robert asked in a neutral voice. "Dad, I asked Attorney Carter for it. I need to talk to you." "We have nothing left to talk about, Jessica. The document is signed. We have no relationship anymore. Dad, please just listen to me for 1 minute. I have cancer." Robert felt a tightness in his chest, not of fatherly love. That feeling had died definitively 2 years ago. It was basic human compassion. "I'm sorry," he said sincerely, "but that doesn't change our situation. Dad, I have no one left. Chad married the other woman. My mom died last year and I didn't even know. I have no one to help me with the treatment." Robert thought of the Jessica from 2 years ago who threw him out of the house, telling him he was a dead weight. He thought of the $80,000 she stole from him over the years. He thought of the coldness with which she treated him when he ended up alone in the hospital. "Jessica, when I needed you, you told me it wasn't your problem. Now, I'm applying the same logic. Dad, I was wrong. I admit it. I was a horrible daughter, but I've learned. I've changed." "You've changed because you're alone and broke," Robert said with a clarity that surprised him. "If you had won the lottery instead of losing everything, you would never have called me." "Dad, that's not true." "Yes, it is, Jessica. And you know how I know. Because for 2 years you made no contact to find out if I was dead or alive. You only called me now that you need help." There was a long silence on the other end. "Dad, I'm begging you. Jessica, I'm going to give you the same advice you gave me 2 years ago. Find a place to get treatment. You don't have a dad anymore." Robert hung up the phone. Helen took his hand. "Was that hard?" "No," Robert replied, surprising himself. 2 years ago it would have been impossible. Today it was just necessary. He went back to his book, but the call made him reflect on everything that had happened since that December afternoon he was kicked out of his house. The great lesson Robert learned at 69 was simple but revolutionary. A father's love cannot be unconditional when the child becomes an adult who chooses to be cruel. For 30 years he had confused parental love with self-sacrifice. He thought being a good dad meant accepting any treatment, forgiving anything, giving everything without expecting anything in return. He discovered that wasn't love. It was self-annihilation. "You know what impresses me most about your story, Robert?" Helen had asked him a few months earlier. "It's how you managed to separate the father you were, who was a wonderful father, from the man you needed to be to protect yourself from a toxic daughter." It was true. Robert didn't regret being a dedicated father. He didn't regret raising Jessica alone, paying for her education, giving everything for her. For years, that period of his life had been genuine and necessary. But he also didn't regret setting boundaries when he discovered that his love was being exploited and despised. Fatherhood is not a lifetime contract of submission. How many fathers out there are financing their own humiliation? How many men are accepting crumbs from someone who received a banquet of opportunities? Robert had discovered that there is a fundamental difference between being a good dad and being a foolish dad. A good dad raises, educates, protects, and prepares his child for life. A foolish dad continues to do that when the child is already an adult and chooses to be cruel. "The most important thing I learned," Robert would tell the men at the club when a new member arrived with a similar story, "is that an ungrateful child is not a reflection of a bad father. Sometimes an ungrateful child is just a child who chose to be ungrateful." For years, Robert had carried the guilt, thinking that if he were a better, more present, more generous father, Jessica would treat him better. He discovered it had nothing to do with him. Jessica had chosen to be a person who exploits those who love her. "And you know what else?" Robert told Helen that morning after the call. "She'll find someone else to exploit. They always do, and when she finds them, she'll forget I exist again until the next crisis." Helen admired how Robert had developed this clarity without bitterness. He didn't dwell on what Jessica had done. He didn't talk obsessively about her ingratitude. He had simply accepted that she was a person he didn't want in his life and had moved on. The same man who carried his daughter on his shoulders one day found himself with no ground to stand on. But when he found firm ground again, he discovered he could build anything on top of it. Robert looked around his patio, the plants he himself had chosen and cultivated, the books he bought because he wanted to read them, the comfortable chair he chose thinking of his own comfort, the life he built thinking of his own tastes and needs. At 69, Robert had learned the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is when you are alone and feel incomplete. Solitude is when you are alone and feel whole. Helen said his name suddenly. "Yes, thank you." "For what?" "For letting me be Robert. Not someone's dad, not someone's ex-husband, not someone's provider. Just Robert." Helen smiled. "Robert is a very interesting man. It was a pleasure to meet him." They returned to their reading, comfortable in each other's company. At 70, Robert Miller had finally learned that loving someone doesn't mean accepting being mistreated by that person, that being a dad doesn't mean being naive, that having dignity isn't selfishness, and that it is never, ever too late for a man to rise again. If Robert's story touched your heart, I want to know where you're watching from. Write your city, your state, or even your country here in the comments. Let me know this message reached you. And if you know a dad who is accepting less than he deserves, share this video, because there are many men who need to understand that valuing yourself isn't selfishness, it's a necessity. If this story made you think, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Also, write what you felt hearing this story. Tell me, have you ever had to set boundaries with your children? Do you know a dad who is being exploited by his own family? And if this story made you think, give it a like and subscribe to the channel to keep watching real stories of men who chose their dignity. Because here, we don't tell stories of victims. We tell stories of starting over. A hug from Chicago. And remember, you built much more than a family. You are a man who deserves respect. How many times do we men swallow disrespect in the name of family peace? How many fathers are financing their own humiliation? Robert learned at 70 that a man doesn't need to accept crumbs from someone who received a banquet of opportunities, that being a dad doesn't mean being exploited, and that it is never, ever too late for a man to stand up and discover his true worth.